All right, so translation theory. So if you look at the notes, it kind of shows you the common understanding of translation theory. It will say word for word, thought for thought, and then paraphrase. It's okay to frame it this way, but it's not the most accurate way to really frame it. It's kind of shorthanding what some of these really are and what they actually do. So let's just start here. Language itself is complicated, as we've said numerous times. So many times, language is just complicated because you don't have perfect corresponding words across languages all the time, and then you have to incorporate culture. So when we think of when we want a translation, a lot of people say, well, I want the most literal translation. I want the Bible to be as literal as possible. But what do you mean by literal? Literal can be used in different ways, especially in literature. Are you talking about you want a this is literally what it means, or do you want a this is the literal words for it? Those are two very different things. Because if you're going to translate, you have to choose if you're going to choose word focus or if you're going to choose meaning focus. Are we literally choosing the meaning? Or are we literally choosing the wording? And then when you involve culture, then it gets even weirder because we talked about this example before. Like Spanish is a simple one. You have numerous words for love. We have one word for love, but we throw adjectives in front of it. But if I went to into a Spanish-speaking country and I used the wrong word for love, or I used the word for love in the wrong context, well, in my head it makes sense because I'm thinking American, I love this, but I used the wrong one where I actually mean I love someone or I really like someone. And it's like, well, that's not the right word to use. So it's culturally incorrect. And that's just the easiest example, which can be rectified a little bit, but still is a problem. So the problem is that when people say this, they often say that they want a translation with English words are the exact same as the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. But as I stated, that technically doesn't really exist. Because, for instance, what do you do with the word to home where we talk about like this chaos water thing? There is no word for chaos waters in English. We just call it chaos waters, which is weird. All right. Language. I've said this before too. Language is not mere dialect, but cultural context and time. Word meaning changes over time, but when it's being used for communication, there is a specific context. If it is written down, then it is bound to a cultural context and time, no matter when the person is reading the document. If I wrote a letter to our pastor, and 50 years from now, someone will read that letter, well, English develops, there's brain rot now. I hate that language. It's so dumb. Or even like just take the word lit. Before it meant like to get completely wasted and plastered, and now it's kind of like something kind of cool. And actually, even now, it's not even used anymore. But if I wrote a letter to Bobby and I was using a lot of language of the day, well, 50 years from now, that language might have changed. And then someone reading it, unless they know the culture of 50 years ago, they might not totally grasp what is being said here. It's just like old English. It's kind of confusing. It's weird. Well, it's the same thing here. Like when you have, we talk about the Bible as being the Word of God, which it is, and but he is still speaking in a context because it has been communicated. The Bible is written to the Israelite people or to the churches of the epistles, so therefore they have a time and a context when they are written down, which means that they were written in a time with an author's intention, with cultural backdropping, with the expectation that the reader would understand what the author meant. Which means for us today, it's going to be not that automatically. Like, even if we don't worry about translation, we find so many times we have to go back and just do a little bit of history for like, why is Paul in prison for XYZ or something like that. Like even just cultural context for history. And then you throw in words, which I said in the first class, I find it weird how we're very comfortable looking at cultural and linguistic context for Paul. When it comes to anyone in the Old Testament, we get very uncomfortable. I find that weird. It's like why we have a double standard of Paul can do it, but no one else can.
What do you mean?
Like, so if Paul used a word that has a very specific context within their culture, that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing today. We would go back and we would try to understand what that word means in that context. Like, oh, okay, so Paul, when he uses this word for pedagogue or teacher, we want to understand what a pedagogue was in that Greek culture. Or he'll use like language as almost like military language to describe the kind of battle that the Christians have against spiritual beings and stuff, or against the flesh. When the Old Testament does that, I find a lot of people, not everyone, and not every passage, but a lot of people I've met, I find it interesting that they are very comfortable with Paul doing that. But if Moses does that, then I'm questioning the Bible. And it's like, why? Because it sounds like Paul, he's addressing the other cultures of his day. Paul's doing the same thing. It's called being a communicator and a speaker. It's not weird. It's just it's what we do. I mean, you write fine books, but I think it's because we add the layer of scripture that people then get concerned that therefore it doesn't mean it's totally for them, even though it still is, or that it doesn't mean what they think it means, and therefore they have to work harder to understand it. I'm not going to say it's true for everyone. I'm just saying that I've had a lot of experiences where there seems to be this weird concern that Paul can do this, but Moses can't, or other authors can or can't. Or like when Peter and Jude reference Enoch. Well, no, they didn't reference Enoch. Yeah, they outright quoted it, and the passages they're quoting are the ones that are referring back to Genesis. So, like, it's there. Why are we freaked out by that? There's no way to hide that, and it's just what they're doing. But if Paul does it, it's fine. I don't get that. No, maybe you've never had that conversation experience. I've had probably about 20 of those. Where they're like, no, it doesn't say that. Do you want me to pull up the word for word verbatim between the two passages? That's what they're doing. It just is. Language already has a lot of nuance. Even languages today, like I said, between English, Spanish, German, like we can learn all these things, but just learning words doesn't mean you truly understand the language. There is a cultural backdrop to some words and how they use those words. Some are offhand, you can't hands off, and some are okay, and then some are like maybe not even used technically anymore, but it's the most literal way to say this word from English to Spanish or from English to German. But in order to really understand language, you got to go into that culture and just kind of spend time at it. Well, we can't really go into the culture of the Bible, but I mean, we can't just jump off into that time period, but we have at least a lot of documents. This is not to say that the English translations aren't trustworthy, but there is a reason why we have so many. There is a reason we have so many, and it's because of this complication of, okay, how do we want to translate this, which we'll get into, and then what time period are we in? Like, how are we going to communicate this? What's our purpose? And then how do we bring this language that's an ancient language too? All three of them are ancient languages. And how do we bring them into our modern language with their ancient concepts and our modern concepts of the world? Because, we don't think of the world in the same way, as we've discovered with our ancient Near Eastern cosmology fun time, where we talked about the sky and that hurt everyone's brain. That was fun for me. But even then, translations already admit this. In fact, you can go to the beginning of your Bible and they'll probably say, like, here's what we did. Some of them will say there's no such thing as a perfect translation. Or they'll say, like, here's our method. It's not the only method. And even then, here's our method. And then here's the following rules we set out to follow. So, rules of translation. This is where we get into the fun stuff. Translating words come down with a question of, are we going to translate the words or meaning? And so some people will tell you that there's two types of translations, word for word and phrase by phrase. Technically, that's not what it is. Is, okay, are we going to translate the word like to the most, if we're going to find the most corresponding English word to this Hebrew or Greek word, or are we going to try and capture the meaning of this word? And therefore, we're going to not use the most exact word that we can try to find. Are we going to try and capture what it means? An easy example of this would be Genesis 2, where it said, God tells Adam, the day of you eat this tree, you shall surely die. So the most literal way you could translate it is in the day. Well, the NIV and some other translations recognize that it's not necessarily talking about a 24-hour period. It's saying that when you do of this, this is going to happen. It doesn't really make it a problem between the two, but one's trying to capture the means like this is more of a when statement, and one's saying that grammatically the most exact words are in the versus just whenever it happens. Yeah, not a big deal there, but that is kind of the difference between the two. First, some other backdrop. When translators go in to develop a translation, they choose between one of the 5, kind of 6. That's why you'll see in the notes there's a question mark next to one of them. It depends if you really want to consider it a separate theory. So I say 5, but you could say 6. Not only do they do that, but then you have to decide on how some other rules of translation. So let's say we're gonna decide on translation theory X, and then and then our goal is to try and translate A, B, and C, these different words, this way as often as we can until we run into an issue where we have to change it. And so, because then it provides some layer of consistency. And that's part of the reason why you have different types of translations within each of the main 5 categories. Because they're saying like, okay, we're going to translate all the words this way. We're going to follow this rule for grammar, and we're going to follow this way of translating for this specific word. And this word will always mean this unless we run into a spot where we can't make it work in any way, and we have to do it this other way. Because again, we don't have the most precise words between the two. So all theories are interpretive. That doesn't mean they're not reliable. It just means that there's interpretation has to be played out, and they vote on things when they have debates on things. Doesn't mean they vote always in the right way. Sometimes they just vote in the way it's going to work best for the translation and for the rules that they set forth. Sometimes it's not so much, okay, is this the most correct way? It's like for consistency of literature, is this the better way to go? Yeah. And so that way we don't provide confusion within what we translated here. And sometimes it is like, all right, we could go either way. Which one do we think it should be? Well, I think it should be this way. No, I think it should be this way. And then they take it to a vote. They're very open about this. In fact, they do several lectures kind of explain how this works. As I said, there's like 5, technically 6 translation theories. And scholars will even then kind of debate on what truly counts as a translation theory. So that's why you tend to hear of 2. You tend to hear of the whole word for word and then phrase by phrase. But there's other layers, and so there are other theories. It's just that those 2 are the most worked on because they're the better way to bring things into an easy way for someone who's able to read it. And then the other ones are for other purposes. So we're going to go down the line. Theory 1 is going to be an interlinear. So an interlinear is going to consist of Hebrew and Greek words in the order of the Hebrew and Greek. And so depending on the one gets, obtain the manuscript on like the top level, then the lemma, which is like the root word. So you have the one of like what is it is in the manuscript. So let's say it was word X and it had these, this gender, this form, and this character. Well, then you go to the next level of the lemma, and therefore just telling you the word by itself, what it is without it being altered. It's kind of like taking, okay, ran, and then underneath it is run. So ran would be like the past tense of the verb of running, and then run is just the verb itself of to go at the brisk motion. And so then beneath that, you might have potential English words, usually one, and then you have the morphology, which again is like if it's a noun, if it's case, it's gender, all the other weird, super nerdy grammar stuff that Caleb talked about last time in our Q&R about that one Greek word. And so they might provide you other extra details. I know Logos provides you a lot of extra details if you want to activate it. And so most of the time with your interlinear, you're probably going to get a King James. At least that's the one I find at bookstores is usually a King James. But if you go to like Logos, you can get pretty much almost any translation, and you can get the interlinear version. And therefore, it'll take the way they translated it, and then it'll put it in the order of the Greek and Hebrew, rather than it being in the English order. But if you get a reverse interlinear, then it's going from the English grammar, and then beneath that is the Hebrew and Greek, and then it puts a little number in the corner saying, here's where it actually falls in the Greek grammar, but therefore it's in the order of the English. So upsides this is you can get to see the original language. That's fun. And the details without having to personally identify them, which makes life easier if you're not a grammar nerd. And then the original structure can be seen sometimes. Depends on how they structure the interlinear. Sometimes you lose the way it's set up. Like if it's in a poetry, you might lose the poetry setup because it's so scattered. Downside, extremely clunky. Like it is not readable for an English person. It is very difficult to read. because it cares this much about English grammar rules, which is partly why some people don't technically consider a translation, but it does fall under one of these theories. Like, okay, are we going to produce a new interlinear for XYZ? Well, now that we have logos, people don't really do that as much. They just kind of like upload their translation into the system, and then you get the interlinear already put together. So you don't have to print it anymore. And so it's not really recommended for people who just want to, who are just getting into Bible study. Is not recommended for people who are not really wanting to do a deep study. It's very much meant for those who are like, I am teaching this stuff, I'm going to do this stuff, and even then, with modern software, you're probably just going to use logos. Caleb and I have also Hebrew and Greek versions of our Bibles. So like we have, not even just an interlinear, we have a copy of the Old Testament just as Hebrew, no English. And we have a copy of the New Testament that is just in Greek. And then we go through that and we say, forget the English, we're going to try and understand what this is purely by itself. And then we can try to understand it differently. Theory 2. This is formal equivalence. This is where we probably get where people know it as a translation. So it's still a second theory version, but it's probably the first one people are going to more naturally buy. So formal equivalence, its primary focus is word-based translation, and its intent is to focus on original grammar. And so it's more focused on translating the words over the meaning of the words. They will sometimes go through an English dictionary and will just try to hunt down some kind of word that is the most closely associated to this Greek or Hebrew word. And then they decide, okay, are we comfortable using this word here? Yes, but it might not be a word people naturally know because they had to hunt it down in the dictionary to find the most closely equivalent word. And then they're also following the grammar. Except in 1 Timothy, which I laughed really hard when Caleb realized that all the formal equivalence ones did not follow the grammar in one, I think it was 1 Timothy 1. There was this one paragraph where they did not follow the grammar in the slightest. And he's like, are you kidding me? You had one job to follow the grammar and you didn't do it. So this is like your ESVs, your NASB, your New King James with a question mark, because technically with the beginning of the King James, in like the very opening, it kind of uses language that falls not in the formal equivalence category, but we treat it like it is. So where you want to officially place it, you could debate on back and forth. Your Legacy Standard Bible, which is supposedly the third update of the NASB, because there was the ASB, I think it was another ASB. Then there was the NASB in 94, NASB in NASB in 95, NASB in 21, and then Legacy Standard in 23. Then you have the Lexham, which I think that one's the second one. And then NRSV, another question mark. Depends on which scholar you want to ask where it falls. Upside is that you get a decent idea what the word meanings are, or at least close to attempts you can get. You get a sense of what the grammar is. It forces you to study, which, I mean, that was their whole goal. They will outright tell you that the ESV is not meant to be a you sit down and read Bible. It's meant to be a you sit down, you study. So they're comfortable putting down these harder words or most closely equivalent words as they can, because their expectation is that you as the buyer are going to study. Their expectation is not that you're just going to sit there and casually read this. If you are, you're not using the ESV with this intention. Each translation does have their own intentions. Dynamic, functional equivalence. Dynamic is the original meaning. Functional has become the meaning they want to use, probably because it makes it a little bit clearer what their purpose is. So its focus, people will say the focus is like, oh, it's a phrase by phrase. The NIV is a phrase by phrase translation. No, it's not. That is not at all what the NIV really is. Now, they might say that in the beginning because they know people are going to understand it that way, and they're just trying to speak in a way that makes sense. But like Bill Mounts, again, Bill Mounts has worked on the ESV and the NIV, and so he's compared the two. And he does not call the NIV a phrase by phrase. He says that he actually calls a different theory a phrase by phrase. And he says even then that's not the proper way to call it this. The NIV still follows the words, but its desire is to try and capture the meaning of those words. Its desire is to understand that, okay, they want to remove some of the ambiguity behind some of the words. So the ESV will be like, okay, what's the most equivalent word? Cool. We found something close to it. We decided on that, and now we're going to say we're going to leave some of the ambiguity there because the Greek has ambiguity there. The NIV seeks to bring some clarity and remove some of the ambiguity by replacing some of the words that are like super literal or precise and put a word that this is what the phrase means. So again, Genesis 2 again, you would have the phrase, in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Well, NIV is recognizing that, okay, this phrase elsewhere is frequently used to mean like when. It's a phrase of words to mean when this happens. So we're going to translate it as when because in this culture and other literature, this is how you would use this word, how you use this collection of words. It's like capturing the sayings and giving you what those sayings mean, whereas the ESV is expecting that you're going to go study what those sayings mean. NIV is just trying to tell you what those sayings mean. Now, it still doesn't get everything. You can't because it's still a translation. So it's still following Greek and Hebrew grammar, and it's still following word by word. It's not doing phrase by phrase. It's not looking at a whole sentence and then giving a little summary. That's honestly kind of spitting in the face of what the NIV people actually did. Whether people intend to do that or not. It's just not what they did. And they deeply cared about this. Bill Mounts, I say this because it was one of his lectures, because I like his lecture because, like I said, he was on both committees. He got to sit in on both. So you can provide perspective on both and not just one. And he's like, NIV people deeply, deeply care. They had one guy come in with 184 recommendations of changes and updates. Some of them were just even headings, like, hey, the passage is doing this grammatically. We should capture that in our subheading so people can see this. So they're not having to hunt it down. They can just know. And they're debating for hours on like how we want to best translate this. Well, I think it should be this way. Well, I don't know if it should be that way. And they go back and forth and they vote. They deeply cared because their desire is to provide a translation that's a little more readable, a little more understandable, but still true to grammar. And so that's kind of a formal equivalence. Dynamic and functional equivalences. So this is gonna be like your NIV, your NET, your CEV, KJV with a question mark, because the language they use in their opening statement follows a little bit of the functional, but they also act like a formal. They're not acting like an in-between. It's just that the language they used, it sounds like it's meant to be functional, but it more so acts like a formal in some places, which is frustrating. I wish they just kind of decided. Oh well. So upside of your dynamics or functionals is that it captures the meaning and makes it more understandable for communication. And then the meaning is conveyed more clearly, which is the purpose of a translation, and that means that one does not have to work as hard to study the ins and outs of Greek and Hebrew. I mean, it tries to follow the whole purpose of translation to the letter. It's meant to convey the meaning of the passage. Therefore, it does that. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. And it makes it more readable. So it's still meant to be studied, maybe not studied in the same depth as the ESV, where you have to do like a whole bunch of word studies to just understand what the heck the passage means. But it's a little more like you could sit down and read the NIV casually. You could. It's a little more easy because it's trying to remove some of the ambiguity. Now, the downside to that is that some Greek and Hebrew words are skipped over, quote unquote, because they're so like again with the in the day you'll eat of this. Well, in the day will now be grouped together as just when, because the phrase means when. But you might see like, oh, that's a lot of words to be clumped together. ESV sometimes will also take one Greek word and then strain 5 words in English to it. So it's not that they're off the hook either. But this means that if you're looking for a precise wording translation, which doesn't exist, you're not going to get that with the NIV. So if you're looking for that, NIV is not the way to go. And it can be seen as more interpretive. Every translation is interpretive. Yes, other ones are more interpretive than others because of what they have to do per their rules. But it's not like your New King James, your ESVs are without interpretation. every single one of them has some layer of interpretation in there. But the NIV can be viewed as more interpretive because it's trying to remove some of the ambiguity. And so for some, this can be seen as problematic. It depends on who you ask. Theory 4, with a question mark. It's a question mark for a reason. So theory 4 is probably the youngest theory. Is called, they want to call it optimal equivalence because it's the most optimal version. Yay. And so what it tries to do is it tries to find the middle ground of the formal and the dynamic, in that it does the word-based translation of the formal with the readability of the dynamic. However you want to explain that works. But that's what they try to do. They try to get the word-based translation, but while still trying to showcase the readability. So whether or not that means you lose some of the extra grammar layer in order for the readability, well, that's what's it's gonna sacrifice. So it seeks to, what it does not take from the other two sides is all focus on the original grammar and does not seek to capture all nuance. So good stuff about it is that it's a middle ground of the two main theories. It makes the formal more readable and the functional more academic, whatever that means. And then downside is still lacking an effort to capture nuance. It's still interpretive. All of them are, but your biggest ones are going to be your CSB and your HCSB. Natural language. This one is still a translation. Technically, so it tries to capture the meaning of the Greek and Hebrew in an English style. So it's slightly different than the dynamic, meaning that it is kind of like we're putting, instead of being strict about the original language grammar, we're going to try and translate this in a way that makes it feel like that you were the recipient. So it's not like a paraphrase. It's desires like, okay, we're trying to make this as natural as possible for the reader, so that way they're comfortable reading it as if it was written in their language. But you can still trace where words, the origins come from. So you still can trace where, like, this word comes from this Greek, or this phrase comes from Hebrew. So it's still technically a translation. So to quote Nita and Tabor, the message of the original text into the receptor language, such that the response of the receptor is essentially like that of the original receptors. So it's focused on the way that this could be read in English grammar over how the original text flows. So upside, very understandable, very readable, very much one that you could sit down and read if you just want to read the Bible, which I encourage people that if you're going to read, you should do Bible study, you should do Bible reading. Yes, you have to read the Bible in order to study it, but Bible study means like you're going to spend time diving into the text and getting into the nitty-gritty. And then Bible reading, in that you're not just going to read a passage and call it a day. You're going to like read big chunks of the Bible and you're going to chew on it like it's literature, like you read a book, and therefore you're trying to try to understand the narrative of the story. You're looking at it as a big picture thing versus like the minute the small details that are in the works. And so it's very easy to do that with this translation. It's focused to help you be able to read it. It's not meant to be a study Bible. It's meant to be a Bible you can sit down and read. Downside, they all have downsides, like I've been saying, is less focused on the original grammar. So it still focuses on a little bit, but it's a lot less focused. It's more interpretive in its ideas that are introduced are not necessarily in the original. So there are words that are added on to try to make sure it is clear, because again, its focuses on English grammar, not on Greek and Hebrew grammar. Now, that's not to say it's adding to the Bible. That's not what it's doing. It's like it sees this phrase, and it's like, okay, well, it says this in Greek, but the only way we can say that in English is if we say it this way. So we have to write it this way because we're capturing what this says. But it's still not a paraphrase because you can trace still the words to their original Greek and Hebrew correspondent. Because that's what a translation is you're taking the words and then you bring it into English and Hebrew. So it's still a translation. It's just a more of a loose translation. This is very much like your NLT. Then there's number 6 or number 5, however you want to count them technically. Transculturations is the technical term. Some will call it paraphrase. Those who work in the fields don't like that people call it a paraphrase because it doesn't really capture the definition of paraphrase, but they will still call it a paraphrase for those who don't know what transculturation is. So to quote Mounts, because I think Mounts helped, or assisted in some way with the message. I think he did. He was an associate of it. Therefore, as he quotes, there is no widely accepted term for this final category of translations that change or distort the historical meaning of the text to make the meaning more apparent. So, upside, it is extremely understandable. Downside, depending on the type you use, either it is completely a translation, it is completely a paraphrase and not a translation. It's also not really a translation at all, but it is a theory. So you're following the Greek and Hebrew, you're reading it in its context, and then you're like, okay, it's kind of like, it's almost like a commentary ish. Even then, that's not a great word for it. It's just a little more complicated. And it focuses much more on our culture rather than theirs. So it's like not going to at all consider ancient culture. It's going to consider our culture and how it can apply to our culture. So this is your New Testament of Modern English, the Message, and the Living Bible. I don't love these. There's some good stuff in them, but they're for sure not ones you would ever preach a sermon on. You might use it for like a point that a scholar makes in there because that's interesting. You wouldn't use it for a study Bible. It might just be you're reading it. Again, it's kind of commentary-ish. Not really. I wouldn't go to it for a commentary. It's a tool that could be used, but to tread carefully because it's not a translation to full sense of what it is. So other factors. So first off, they first decide on which of the six categories they want to do. We're going to do formal equivalents. Great, we decide that. Now they have to consider some other details. First, audience. They have to decide on who is the reader that they're trying to translate this for. So again, the ESV is meant to be for those who want to study the text. It is not meant for those who just want to casually read. So people say, like, what's the best Bible to read? Well, what's your intention with the Bible? Well, I just want to understand the biblical story. Well, don't tell them to read the ESV. That's not going to help them. That's just going to make it more confusing for them. Because that is not its purpose. Its purpose is not meant to be for brand new Christians to go read. And when people do that, before I was like, yeah, the ESV is the most accurate. And I'm like, there is no such thing as the most accurate translation. Most accurate copy of the Bible is the Hebrew and Greek. And no one knows how to read that unless they want to go and learn that. So if you're talking to someone's like, I want to know the biblical story, NLT, NIV, bam, done. ESV that's not its purpose. Its purpose is meant to be for those who like want to study the text, and they outright tell you that this is its purpose, because they have an audience in mind. So I'll use the ESV again. So they have stated that if they could pull up the Webster's dictionary and check the English to find a word that fits something close to what the Greek is, they're okay with it. They plug it in. NIV, NLT, so the natural language and the functional, they're not seeking to do that. They're seeking to capture different elements of the text. ESV is not trying to do that. The expectation is that the reader is going to not just read, is going to study, whereas the NIV has a more of a focus on people will hear and understand. The NIV wants this so that way if you could read this in church, the people in the congregation, if they don't have it in front of them, can understand what's being said. Their desire is for the people to understand, while also still following the original grammar. And this kind of comes down to the age of the audience or the stage of life that the audience is at. So an examples I provided below for this one, just to kind of really capture this. For background for the audience, so for the audience is like the intention of what they're going to study, like metaphors. So Ephesians 5:2, NIV from 1984 reads, and live a life of love. Ephesians 5:2, regular modern day NIV reads, and walk in the way of love. ESV, and walk in love. I think we can understand what all those mean. We can see that NIV tries to remove some of that ambiguity a little bit and just make it so clear, like, okay, you're walking in this way. Whereas ESV is just like, the word way is not there, so walk in love. Hope you know what that means, guys. If you don't, better study, because our job here is not to like hold your hand and help you figure it out. Our job is just to tell you what this is. So that's an example of this. So they're considering the background of their audience and who they're translating this for. So if you're not a Christian who's been in the faith for a little bit and has at least some of an understanding of the Bible, the ESV is not designed for you. And if we tell people who are brand new Christians, hey, read the ESV, the ESV people themselves will tell us, what are you doing? That's not its purpose. Like you're misusing our Bible, our translation. That's not what it's there for. Some other things they consider is terminology, such as Christianese words needs to be considered, like the words blessing, holy, words we kind of throw around that I argue we don't really know what they mean half the time. Like I can go to several people and say, what does blessing mean? And I've seen some people kind of draw a blank face because we say it all the time. We don't really know what blessing is. And even then, sometimes it's a word that is just kind of put in the translation because it was the only word that kind of fit, because the word has a lot more weirdness for us to it. Like, oh, it's like these extra layers, and they're trying to find a way to condense it to one word. So Christianese needs to be considered, which also plays into your audience and where they're at. So the NLT decided to use none of this. They decided to avoid Christianese stuff. So they don't use like terms like blessed, saints, and holy. They kind of shoot to ignore that because their expectation is that the reader doesn't know what these words mean. So they're not going to just put it on you where you now read a passage and you're like, what the heck is this word? And then you have to do an English study and then the Greek study to really capture it. The NLT wants to really help the reader understand it in any way they can. An example of this with Acts 9 verse 13. The ESV reads, but Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. NLT just says the believers in Jerusalem. Well, NIV also makes a similar decision as the NLT. And we understand that ESV people will argue that they think the NLT is wise in capturing that believer thing because they know that some people want to understand what saints are. And understand that saints doesn't mean that it is just those who are the most holy people. But they also argue that if we understand that saints is like this really deep word, and we just translate it as believers, we can lose some of the deep nuance or intention of this word that Paul uses. The NIV also makes its decision, and a couple scholars, like Bill Mounce, I say Bill Mounce a lot because he's probably done the most free access to translation theory for some people, so I like to reference him because people that can just go find it and not have to spend any money on him. He has like a paper you can read for free, and he has an entire lecture series that you can just watch for free. Because he wanted to make it easier for people to get access to this. But he said on this, as well as a couple other people who are new to the committee, and they were kind of wondering about this choice, and they found out that the NIV had a deep concern that many lay people in the church would see this word saint and put this idea that there are the people who do all this stuff and they're saints, and then there's us. And so they wanted to avoid this dividing line of like, oh, well, they're saints and we're just the congregation. You could argue that's a slippery slope fallacy a little bit, but there's a concern that it's not without precedence. There is a lot of that view in the church today. So it's a slippery slope fallacy, assume that people are going to assume that. But also it's not like it's not warranted because they see it happening. So they just want to remove that possibility altogether. They put believer there instead of saint. But the reason like the ESV keeps is that they decided to use saint because it is a more of a positional word in that we are all positionally sanctified and are saints in Christ. And so there's experiential sanctification, which is what we tend to talk about, how you're being made, you're growing in your formation of Christ. Like Paul says that you'll be formed in the image of Christ. You're going to keep becoming more and more like him. And versus like a positional sanctification, like you're it's kind of like justification, like your position, like your status is that you are sanctified, you are justified, you are holy, you are a saint. And so the ESV sees that the word saint here is being used as a positional, that all Christians are saints, no matter what. That is who you are, and that you are viewed highly in the eyes of the Lord and deeply loved, and that there is nothing that makes one person greater than you. And so they think that word should stay there. The NIV is worried that people won't see that in the NLT, and therefore they want to use believers instead. So it's a real concern, is warranted, bit of a slippery slope fallacy, but it's not like it's unheard of. So you can argue it both ways. There's also the consideration of English style. So how are you gonna translate this in ways for readers to understand it? Are we going to make it so it's really easy to understand English, or are we going to kind of just ignore that? Hence why the other theories. But an example would be like you have some passages where they use like talents, or like tens of thousands or whatever, and they refer to these things, and then the NLT will be like, no one's gonna know what that means. No one knows that unless you're studying the culture. Like no one knows what those are. So let's just find the best way to phrase this. It's like saying millions and millions of dollars. So it's a phrase that means a whole lot of money. And the NLT is like, let's understand that that's what the Hebrew or the Greek is saying, and put that phrase there because now the readers understand what they're saying. They may not necessarily be talking about this precise amount. They just mean it's a whole lot of money, or it's a whole lot of whatever. And so English style, are you going to choose to make the readers do the work, or are you going to help them understand what this phrase means? Or are you going to follow some English grammar, or are you going to follow strictly the Greek and Hebrew? We mentioned ambiguity already. ESV allows ambiguity. NIV tries to avoid some of it. NLT leaves none of it. So natural language, no ambiguity. Functional, we'll leave some. If we can't, at least we can keep it true to the grammar still. And formal, they're like, your job is to study, man. No, we don't care. you need to study. This is the whole point of our translation. We're helping you learn to study. Then there's implicit and explicit. So there are several things in the Hebrew and Greek that are hard to understand and translate. So nuance can very much be lost. And I would argue that every translation loses some nuance in certain passages. It's just the nature of the fact we've lived in very different cultures and languages. So some translators will try to bypass this to help the reader gather these like implicit statements that would be for the original audience. Oh yeah, we get that. But for us, it's like, what? What does that mean? So that it kind of depends on how far you want to go with that. Filling out the story. Are we adding extra details depending on the theory you're following to make it clearer what's going on in the story, or are we just going to leave it out? Some people could see this as this can lead to some more interpretive decisions and divisions between the translations. It depends on, are they going to try and help you understand the narrative that's happening there more, or are they going to just kind of, again, make you do the work for it? Misunderstandings. So there's a concern of misunderstanding. So they vote on any areas that they try to understand, but that doesn't mean that the vote is always right. Sometimes the vote doesn't end up in the right way. Like I argue, and several other scholars argue. I mean, I'm not a scholar, but that the translation for the woman's punishment in Genesis chapter 3, for some translations, there's a fine word to use, but it's the wrong nuance. And then some are just the wrong words, period, because it's just not what the Hebrew technically means. But if we use probably the most literal words for it, it might get more confusing. So we have to bite the bullet there and deal with it. Sensitivity, being aware of audience and culture. So again, our culture, our use of language, it could be like pull up a dictionary and just select all these words, but also like if people don't use these words anymore and now language has become outdated for certain words, it doesn't matter if that's the right word. We now need to find a way that they can actually understand, so we have to be sensitive to it. Or even like there's certain understanding of like the word slave. Okay, so are we going to be sensitive to the fact that there's going to be some misunderstanding that how this passage uses slave versus this passage, and people are going to bring the wrong assumptions to the text? So what are we going to do about this? How do we want to handle this? So that might be something to consider. Theological biases, they try very hard to avoid these. There was one that was done entirely by DTS, I think, or most of the team was done by DTS, Dallas Theological Seminary, so very Baptist. And so there's some nuances of Baptist tradition has slipped in. I can't remember all of them. I'll tell you that a lot of people thought a lot of dispensationalism was going to slip into their interpretation of certain passages, and they kind of avoided that. They just kind of said, we're not going to force that onto people. So, but still use some theological biases that might slip in. I can't remember which translation it is. There was one that Richard Stein argues is extremely Calvinistic from way back when. And so they took some words and translated because of their certain understanding of what certain passages mean, rather than just translating the words themselves. And so that sometimes happen. People have been getting better about it. And then they decide on rules for words. But committees are formed to do these translations. NIV, I think, had 20 people, and ESV, I think, had 15, maybe some more. And then sometimes they'll divide it up into sections, or they might do it all together. So it might be like, hey, you take these set of books, we'll take these set of books, or hey, let's all do this together. And then they check each other's work, and then if they disagree, they'll debate and they'll vote. So it's a long process. I'm very much giving the short version of how this works. It's a long process, hence why it takes forever to do. But that's also why we tend to get so many translations, because it is complicated to bring an ancient language. It's complicated to bring any language, especially an ancient language, into our modern day language. And you can't do all that in one translation. It's not possible unless we just completely change cultures. Not only that, but as we find more things in archaeology, sometimes we're like, oh, it would be better translated this way. Example, John 3:16, New King James and King James. Well, I think New King James will say this. It will say, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So that was when they believed that monogene came from mono and genao. And so, because that's the, because monogene is used there, and there are other passages that use monogenao, and so they assume like, okay, it must be that's the root of this word, these two words. Later on, we discovered that monogene comes from mono and genes, and so we therefore now have translations that have removed begotten from that passage because that's just not the right structure. So that's why you'll see something that says the only son or the only unique son or something like that, because it's the same word used for Isaac for Abraham and in Hebrews, where Hebrews is talking about Isaac as his monogene of Abraham. Well, it doesn't mean he's the only begotten son of Abraham, because he had Ishmael and many other kids, but he's the only unique one. He's the only one of promise. However, we do see only begotten use of Christ in other passages. It just is that John 3:16 isn't the one to use it. So they then went in and updated those words. And that's another reason why we get updates in translations. Like, oh, we made an error here, we need to fix it. Or, oh, we found something new and we think it warrants a translation fix. So then they go and fix it. So all translations, or not, maybe not all, a lot of our translations are a great blessing, and a great deal of work has gone into us getting them. So we should be very thankful for them. They're very reliable, help us understand the gospel narrative. However, we have to understand that inerrancy does not fall on the English translations. It just can't. It's just not logically possible. And unless you're KJV only people, and then I just say you're wrong, because you are. But we must remember that inerrancy doesn't fall on these words. Is not based on our translations. And it takes a committee to do all this work, and they even acknowledge that there's no such thing as a perfect translation. In fact, they're the first ones to say this isn't perfect. We had to make some sacrifices here just due to grammar rules or things to decide on. And then you'll hear them even say, I still disagree with our decision to do this one. I think we should have done this way, but I got outvoted. So it's just a matter of how they want to handle it. And it could be voted on because they disagree, or no, we said we're going to do it this way, so we have to do it this way. So then they do it that way. They're very reliable, they're very helpful, but it's not like they're perfect. So we still have to understand that they are a great deal of scholarship. We respect them, we use them for great study. But understand that we can be forgiving and maybe not quick to doubt our faith when someone says, oh, look, here's a contradiction. One, it might not actually be a contradiction. It might honestly just be a misreading of the text, like reading comprehension. Or it could easily be, oh, it's because this Hebrew or Greek word here really means this, but because of XYZ set of rules, they had to go this way, and therefore they probably got stuck on how they want to handle this best. Which means, is Christianity in trouble? No, it just means humans are fallible and we tried to translate something. Also, even if the Bible does have errors, Jesus still rose, so we're good. So spending time. So that's why a lot of people say if you're going to study the Bible, but you're not going to necessarily get into Hebrew and Greek, spend time cross-referencing different translations, because you might find there's some deeper layers there, and you'll definitely see sometimes where you see where they get stuck on a word when they all translate them different words because they don't know how, they're not sure what is the best way to do it, and so they all will disagree on what to do with that word. Not in disagree like an argumentative way, but like the rakia. So many translations have different ways of translating the rakia, just due to the rules that they set out and how they're trying to find the best equivalent Greek English word for it. It just happens. Yay.